In the last video we explored the assumption that terrorists are mentally ill or psychotic. And in this video we'll look into the assumption that terrorism has become more lethal, more deadly in the past decades. This assumption can be interpreted in two ways. First, you can look at the number of fatalities, the total number of people being killed in terrorist attacks. And you can also see it from a different angle by looking at individual terrorist attacks. Have they become more deadly? Are there today more victims per attack than in the past? It should be noted that these two sides are independent of each other. The origin of this claim or assumption can be linked to the idea that terrorism has been the defining feature of our era and that we live in a post-9/11 world. And it's also rooted in the idea that the size and shape of terrorism is different. It's different now than in the past. After 9/11 it has become a very big threat, more so than in the past. Here are some examples of quotes by politicians, government agencies and scholars that hint at a new type of terrorism, one that is deadlier than in the past. Well, the first quote is by Dick Cheney, who was then the Vice President of the United States. And in 2004 he said, "The biggest threat we face now as a nation is the possibility of terrorists ending up in the middle of one of our cities with deadlier weapons than have ever before been used against us. Biological agents or a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon of some kind to be able to threaten the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans." On the other side of the globe you have the Australians, and the Australian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in that same year stated something similar. It stated, "Advances in weapons technology are making them, the terrorists, more lethal than ever before. The range of weapons at the terrorist disposal is wide and increasing." And finally a quote from a scholar, Peter Neumann, a German scholar working in London at King's College, who in 2009 said, "In the era of the new terrorism, the two considerations, violence and symbolic value, seem to have merged, with mass casualty attacks against civilian populations being routine and intentional." Are these ideas and statements based on facts and proper analysis? Well, unfortunately, the attacks on 9/11 and the ones in Bombay, Beslan, Baghdad and Bali, they were facts. And these and other deadly attacks cost the lives of many people. So yes, they were very lethal. And they made headlines worldwide, sometimes for days. Well, if you add then also the many threats posed by terrorist groups to attack, including threatening to do so with weapons to be used in mass casualty attacks, and also add the interest of certain groups in unconventional weapons and even weapons of mass destruction, then the idea of increasing lethality becomes even stronger. And we did see in the streets of Iraq and Pakistan people that are willing and able to make more sophisticated explosives and to use them in suicide attacks. In other words, a worrisome combination of new techniques and tactics. And maybe I should add different ethics and different codes that make it possible for terrorists to kill more people and to kill more people at the same time. In a previous video I quoted Brian Jenkins, who in 1975 stated that terrorists want a lot of people watching but not a lot of people dead. And I also said that in 2006 he rephrased that statement. In 2006 he said, "The most striking development is that terrorism has become bloodier in terms of what acts are committed and how many victims are involved." And in his publication in 1975 he described a number of constraints that terrorists were facing at that time. These constraints included a sense of morality, a self-image, operational codes and practical concerns. Well, in 2006 he noted, "These constraints gave way to large-scale indiscriminate violence." And he rephrased his famous quote from 1975. And the new quote is as follows. He says, "Many of today's terrorists want a lot of people watching and a lot of people dead." Is Brian Jenkins right in assuming that terrorists want a lot of people dead? And have terrorists managed to achieve that? Has terrorism become more deadly than in the past decades? Why should we investigate this assumption? Well, if terrorism is becoming more lethal, maybe we should devote more means to fight this very serious physical threat. But what if it's not? Well, we think it is. Maybe we have spent too much money on countering it. Money, scarce resources we could have used for other important issues, such as the eradication of poverty, making the world a better place. But if terrorism is indeed more deadly, maybe we should look for tougher measures to fight it. But if it's not, maybe we should have a closer look at the proportionality of the measures we've taken in the past. Maybe it has become less deadly, and maybe we have overreacted after 9/11. 9/11 and other such attacks that gave us the impression, rightly or wrongly, that terrorism has become more deadly. Myth or fact? Let us compare the assumption with empirical evidence. What are the numbers of people killed in terrorist attacks, and how does that develop over time? To answer that question, we use the background report 9/11, 10 years later, of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, also known as START, which is based at Maryland University. Here is a graph with the number of fatalities worldwide because of terrorism in the period 1991-2011. So the period before and after the attacks on the United States. What do you see? Well, you see that the numbers are pretty high in the early 1990s with 8,000 to 10,000 people being killed. Then it goes down, 1995, goes up again to a pretty high number in 1997, and it reaches a relatively low number just before 9/11. Still quite a number of people killed because of terrorism. I mean 2,000, 3,000 too many, but a relatively low level. And then 9/11, that itself cost 3,000 lives, shows an increase, but also very quickly it goes back to pre-9/11 levels. And then from 2003 on, you see a gradual increase, which leads to a peak in 2007, 2008 of more than 12,000 or about 12,000 fatalities in those years. But since then, the line again is going slightly downward until 2012, when there were about 11,000 people killed. And in 2013 and 2014, it went up again to an all-time high in 2014 with over 30,000 people dead because of terrorism. And this is to a large extent related to the civil wars in Syria and Iraq. So what do we make out of this? What do you think yourself? How would you describe this trend? And how does it relate to the discussion on definitions of terrorism? Well, I think it can best be described as a line with ups and downs. And it also very much depends whether or not you consider the casualties of the violence in Syria and Iraq as casualties of terrorism. If you take those two countries out of the statistics, the picture suddenly looks very, very different. Against this backdrop, it's safe to say that it's difficult to speak of a general trend, and I think there are no indications for the future. It could go up again. It could go down even further. I think what you can say is that there is no general trend, and it's definitely not one that is always going upwards. But what about the lethality in terms of the number of people killed or injured per attack? Is there a clear picture regarding this part of the assumption? Well, again, I would like to use the work of James Piazza, who also was helpful in exploring whether or not poverty leads to terrorism. And in a study, an article of his from 2009, he explores data on victims per international terrorist attack. So he doesn't look at all types of attacks, but he talks about international terrorist attacks. And he used the data of the terrorism knowledge base that was later incorporated in the global terrorism database. Well, he shows that the number of victims per international terrorist attack has increased. His data show that in the period 1968-1979, there were on average a little over 2 victims per attack. And that includes both injured and killed. And that number has gone up. In the 1980s it was almost 4, and in the 1990s it increased to over 10 victims per attack. And in the first 5 years of the new millennium, so between 2000 and 2005, it increased even further to almost 11 victims. Well, this provides us, I guess, with a clear picture regarding lethality when looking at the number of casualties per attack. Unfortunately, it has gone up in recent decades. And now the conclusion. Myth or fact? True or false? Is terrorism becoming more deadly? We already falsified the part of the assumption that says that terrorism kills more and more people each year. Fortunately, that is not the case. But the part of the assumption that says that there are more victims per attack, more people killed and injured in each incident, well, that has gone up in recent years. Combining the two, I think we should conclude that the assumption that terrorism is increasingly lethal is partly true. To sum up, we discussed the perception that terrorism has become increasingly lethal, especially after 9/11. This is only partly true. The number of fatalities each year has gone up and down in the past decades. Only the number of victims per attack has increased significantly. In the next video, we're going to look into the assumption that terrorism is predominantly anti-Western.